Hey everybody, welcome. Thanks for joining us for another Sales Hacker webinar. I'm Colin Campbell, I'm your host. I'm the Director of Marketing at Sales Hacker. Today, we are talking about the CCPA, the California Consumer Protection Act. We're going to talk about what it is, how it's different, and in some ways similar to GDPR, how it impacts revenue teams, because that's what we're all about. But then because we're Sales Hacker, we're also going to make this actionable. And we're going to tell you some of the things that you can do to actually start preparing, regardless of what systems you're using, what kind of data structures or systems you have in place now, some of the things that you can do to make sure that you're compliant when this thing kicks in January 1st of 2020. So we've got some pretty amazing speakers here today to help walk us through each of those pieces. First of all, we've got Daniel Barber. So Daniel is the founder and CEO of DataGrail, which I guess I would describe as a privacy compliance platform. Daniel, you'd probably describe it better than that, though. Can you do that?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for inviting us, Colin, first off. Yeah, CEO and co-founder of DataGrail. So purpose-built platform for sustained data privacy compliance or continuous data privacy compliance. And yeah, excited to share a few tips and sort of observations we've seen. And yeah, kick it over to Sean.
Yeah, we're really happy to have you here. You guys both together, you've seen so many of these compliance programs put into place. You probably have all of the do's and don'ts under your belt. And so on your right, on the viewer's left, Sean. So Sean's head of operations at DataGrail. Do you want to introduce yourself, Sean?
For sure. So I look after a lot of the operations here, and prior to coming over to DataGrail, I was with a company called Domino Data Lab, doing revenue operations there. And so I got to be the revenue ops person in charge of GDPR readiness and how we approach that through all the learnings and problems that you kind of get to go through there. So get to now channel some of that into helping everyone else.
Awesome. And then lastly, we have Martin Ruiz. So Martin is the CISO at Outreach. And if you don't know, Outreach is a sales engagement platform, basically like the system of action, the single pane of glass where any customer-facing person can speak to, communicate with prospects or customers on any channel. So as you can imagine, as the CISO of such a platform, Martin has to be pretty concerned with compliance and privacy and security, not just from the legal side of things, but also as it affects a growing company. So Martin, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Yes, you're absolutely right. These are the types of things that keep me up at night. But our goal at Outreach is to build a platform and include features that make compliance with regulations like CCPA easier for our customers.
There it is. And so between the three of you guys, I'm pretty sure we have the right brains in the room to share, here's what you need to know to start getting ready today. So as I said, we're going to do a quick introduction, what is this thing? We're going to talk about how it compares to GDPR, because I think a lot of us should be at this point pretty familiar with how that's playing out. We're going to talk about how it affects revenue and security teams, but really how they should partner together. This isn't too often people think of this as something that just affects, legal or data compliance teams. No, this actually has a pretty big effect on all revenue teams. And then we're breaking it down into here are the 5 things that you can do regardless of your situation to start preparing today or next week, but you should probably start today. So to start off, maybe we should start, and Daniel, I think you have something on this with, what does this mean? Because I think we all remember last year GDPR kicked in. Now we've got CCPA. What does this mean for the privacy world right now?
Yeah, so in many respects, I think everyone probably remembers, the May 20th period where we received privacy policy updates from practically every company you can imagine. Your inbox was inundated, right, of folks who are letting you know they're changing the way they, structure their practices around data privacy. But actually the GDPR itself, so the General Data Protection Regulation was really what drove that. that came out in 2016. So while the lead up was 2 years, you saw everyone kind of scramble at the last mile to make sure that they were updating their policies and informing their consumers and users. And, that's sort of the big change that happened there. The interesting thing is what we're talking about today, the California Consumer Privacy Act. This is really an expansion of a global trend, right? Of privacy reform that went through California to India, Brazil. There are around 10 other states in the US now that are proceeding with similar type of regulatory frameworks. And so, in reality, we see this as kind of a socioeconomic trend, less of a one-off. And so a lot of what we'll talk about today obviously applies to this specific piece of regulation, which is going to affect a lot of US businesses. And it's important to note there that, for folks who perhaps didn't have a European presence or the European presence wasn't as prominent, the GDPR was less applicable, right? For California's regulation, we're talking about 39 million people in the state of California. And so there are many things that we'll talk about today in terms of how do you address folks who are not perhaps in California, but do they get the same type of privileges or rights? So just things to consider, but really this age of privacy, this was a term that came out in 2010, around that period. It's certainly gaining momentum. And from our view, companies now and consumers really expect sort of transparency and control over how their data is used.
Yeah. I think that's an interesting point. And the fact is that these regulations are almost more reflective of an attitude that already exists than they are introducing that attitude. So one thing, we just got a question. I just realized I missed this. So first of all, this is being recorded. So from a privacy standpoint, you should all know that. But also, if you have to go walk away and do something, or you just really want to share this with somebody, you will get the recording and these slides to share around the latest tomorrow. And then the other thing is, I'm seeing the Q&A piece being used, but if you look at your screen right down there, there's a Q&A button. Go ahead and actually right now, everybody click that, open it. You can use that to talk to Martin, Sean, Daniel, and if you really want to, you can talk to me. You can add your experience and your comments, ask them questions, and we'll make sure as many of them get answered as possible, because I know this can be a bit of a muddle. Hi, Karine. Hi, John. Please use that. Let us know your role, your company, and then keep it open so that you can talk to us throughout. So one of the things that we just want to double click on this a little bit, right, Danielle, is what are the actual rights that are worth looking at now that the CCPA is about to come into place?
Yeah, so great question, Colin. So, in reality, there are a lot of rights that individuals will have under the California Consumer Privacy Act. And we sort of have a comparative slide coming up here as it compares to the GDPR. But the ones that are probably most important for this audience, and just for folks in the US, perhaps haven't had these rights before, right? And so when we talk about access, what we're really saying is if you contact a business, or if you are contacting someone about your products or services, so you're using outreach and you're contacting folks, they may, as of January 1st, ask you, where did you get their information? And so as it's described, you need to be able to provide, the business needs to be able to provide disclosure around where that information came from. Where did you get their email address? Where did you get their phone number? And so Californian citizens will have that ability as of January 1st, 2020. And so again, this is probably a new concept for a lot of folks in the US. Europeans have this today under the GDPR, but there's a secondary component of that's unique in that this opt-out concept. And so the legislation really is supporting the restriction of sale. So meaning that if your information is being sold to other organizations, consumers can actually opt out of that. So, common practice today is sharing of lists or sharing of your information for credit bureaus or things of that nature. You can now opt out of that if you're living and residing in California. That is unique, and so it's worth mentioning. It is required that these types of rights can be accessed on the website. There's a couple of vehicles to be able to do that. And of course, there's the similar type of setup with the GDPR around erasure. So deletion of data, and there are some exceptions there, but these three rights in particular really are unique in that they've not been offered to folks in California before. And if you have more, or if you're curious about sort of what the expanded regulation looks like, Gunderson and Detmer did put out a very good post, a concise post. If you search that title there, you'll find it. It's really, really short and easy to read. So if you're looking for more information, that's one area, one resource I would strongly recommend.
Thanks, Daniel. And yeah, that post is really good. We'll send out the slides, so if you want to go read it, you'll have the link. And a couple points of clarification there, Daniel, actually. So you said this is if they live and reside in California, right? This is not like they just happen to be visiting. This is not that they have a VPN in California. They live and reside there.
Correct.
And does it only apply to a U.S. citizen or anybody living and residing in California?
The latter, yeah. So,
okay.
yeah.
And then the question from Victoria Hanlon. Thanks, Victoria, for the question. She's been advised that the CCPA only applies to companies with revenues over 25 million, or if they get more than 50% of their revenue from the sale of data. Is that right?
Correct. There is a additional piece though. If you have over 50,000 individuals that you hold data for, that then makes you applicable to the regulation. So there's sort of a set of or statements there. So yes, 25 million in revenue, or half of revenue coming from the sale of data, or you hold more than 50,000 individuals' personal data records. So think about it as email addresses or phone numbers or things of that nature.
Right. And one thing that like some people are pointing out in the Q&A right now, and I think it's worth stating that a lot of this, from what I've read, and I did go try to read what's published about this so far, it seems like some of this and some of the specificities around what qualifies and what doesn't may actually have to be decided in courts. Like it's not all written with a great level of specificity right now. Is that fair to say?
It is still evolving, the regulation itself. I would say these specific rights that we have displayed right now are confirmed. There are some amendments, so that's, you can see the proposed amendments. The amendments are really around, so one of them is related to a phone number. So up until recently, a phone number needs to be required. There's discussion of whether that will be required on someone's website, meaning a phone number you could call and say, look, I don't want to use your service. Please delete my information from your company. So that was a debated topic. And so those items and a few others are being debated. But the specifics around really what they're defined as is, right to know and right to say no. Right to know, just as it sounds, get the information a business has about you, or right to not say no, actually delete your information from my information from your company, or opt out of service in the sale of data.
Got it. Okay. There's a whole lot of questions about clarification, which we may come back to, but I also think some of what's coming up will help, guys. So hang on to a few of those questions. One of the things that may be useful actually is just to compare this with what we're all maybe a little bit more familiar with. So Martin, do you think you could tell us a little bit about how the CCPA compares to GDPR?
Sure. We did a lot of work last year to get ready for GDPR, and as we were researching, what's the diff? What's the extra work we might need to do for CCPA? I came across this comparison, which I think is incredibly valuable. As you can see, most of CCPA is actually narrower than GDPR. So we're taking the approach of follow the strictest guideline and you'll be okay. We're in luck. We don't sell the data that we collect. So there's not as big of a concern there for us. But even where things are, say, not included in CCPA, we are still going to allow that right to all customers. Right, so we're not going to parse out, well, only the EU, somebody that calls from the EU can correct errors in their data. We will allow that for anybody. But I think one of the key things to point out here is the difference between GDPR and CCPA around GDPR being about data that you're processing. You can be processing that in multiple ways and in multiple systems, where CCPA is really about that data collection aspect, right? When GDPR came out, a lot of people, as Daniel mentioned, sent out, hey, we're updating our privacy policy. A lot of them also went and wiped out their databases in terms of, I don't have consent to even process your data. I'm going to go recollect that consent. And we'll talk about that a little bit later as a strategy.
Yeah. I remember seeing a few of those re-opt-ins myself,
yep.
Which made me wonder, why I was on the email list for so long if I didn't even remember opting in the first time.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So we've got some people with varying levels of experience in the audience and a lot of really good questions. Thank you, everybody. Just know I see them. I'm hanging on to them. We're going to get to them. One thing that maybe would help is if we take some time to just talk about like how this impacts you, the audience, right now. So we actually have a poll that we can launch, which you should see in just a second, pop up from Zoom. There it is. So has your sales cycle been impacted by data privacy concerns in the last year as you take your product to market? Please just pick one of the options. I'll give you a second to think and answer. And then we'll go ahead and close that poll and show you the results. Okay, so about 50% of you say yes, your sales cycle has been impacted by those concerns. A third of you know, some of you don't know, which is, I think, also, it's very honest of you. I think a lot of us may not know that. We also have another data source on this, actually. So this is pretty much in line, kind of, with what we've seen. Daniel, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So I think what's interesting, so first off, this study was from Cisco. They do a regular series on cybersecurity. So this data is from January of this year. North of 80% of folks are indicating that there is some delay in sales cycles, whether it is with existing customers or actually new customers. A lot of that comes from agreements that may need to be completed. So DPA agreements, data processing addendums or agreements that companies are issuing and requiring that security or privacy teams complete. Additionally, questions around how data is actually being collected may slow down sales cycles. And so Cisco at least sort of suggests, similar to the results that we just saw, there is an impact. And I would suspect that as we see California's regulation move forward, companies that are not ahead of the game probably will, see an extended impact as well. And so for everyone joining on the call, you're taking the first steps. That's great. So yeah.
Sorry, I went on mute because I have a cough. and then I forgot to come off. So I think what you were just saying, that's kind of proof that this is not just applicable to like the security team or the privacy or legal team. Like this is a whole organization thing. And I think it's really a sea change in how we think about doing business. Maybe it feels a little bit like the days of the wild, wild west on the internet are coming to an end. One of the questions that we've gotten from Liam Mulcahy, thanks for the question, Liam, is what does this mean for the Zoom infos of the world? And obviously that, that's speculation, but I think it might be interesting to hear what you think about that. So I don't know, Martin, do you have a feeling on that? Like, what does this mean for organizations that sell data?
We're going to talk a little bit about what that means in step 3, but what I really think it means is you have an added responsibility to have permission to do so, right? Scraping websites and buying data from somebody to resell it is quickly going to no longer be an option.
Yeah, and so that goes for like an operator like Outreach, but also somebody like ZoomInfo where the data is their product. Yeah. So if it's becoming more difficult for them, maybe it means their product becomes more expensive if they have to do some extra work to get it.
Yeah, I do know that there are some examples of data providers in the EU, and a lot of customers are switching to them to say those data providers comply with GDPR. Their lists are GDPR compliant. They have already gotten the permission from the people in those lists to use their data in that way. And so businesses have switched to providers that can demonstrate that. So I think for the US, it'll become a similar path.
Interesting. Daniel and Sean, are you guys seeing similar things?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, ultimately, if you're a data provider, so if we think about those rights, if you're a data provider, so if you're on a revenue team and you're using data from that provider, you need to disclose where that person's information actually came from, right? So we'll talk about it. Actually, it's part of the responding to requests step 4. So that's good. So if you're on a revenue team, we'll be covering what that looks like. If you're the provider itself, so you actually sell data, and there are a number of companies like that, businesses under the current construct may become a little bit more challenging, especially because your customers who are using that data may ask for it to be deleted or retrieved on a more consistent and frequent basis.
And I think in that also, if you're hosting events and there's an attendee list, and then you have somebody else sponsoring the list and you pass it over to them, that's like you're selling data. You kind of have to act the same way. So it applies to a lot of companies, ZoomInfo and those sorts.
Correct.
Yeah. So one of the questions we got was like, how does this apply to B2B? That's it. I mean, it's if you want to look specifically at CCPA, it's if your organization or your prospect's organization has employees that live and reside in California, those employees are covered by the CCPA. It actually doesn't matter where the business is headquartered. It's where they live and reside. So anyway, really interesting thoughts, and we can come back to some of that, but let's make sure we give the people some steps that they can take. A lot of these questions from the audience sound like they may need to speak to a lawyer. Just to, we're not legal advisors, but operationally speaking, there are some things that you can do to start preparing. So first of all, like you have to make sure that you're not just the only one working on this in your organization, and it's really a team effort. And Sean, because you did this in your last role in preparing for the GDPR, went through all those little steps. Can you walk us through some of the things that we should consider in building stakeholder alignment?
For sure. And so this is going to be somewhat of the first step in many projects, and it's really about identifying who needs to be involved. Sales and marketing are obviously sort of the obvious answers, but you need to think more broadly than that. I'm going to guess your recruiting team ends up interacting with personal data from people living in California. If your product team is collecting information inside your product or sending surveys or getting feedback, they're probably involved. So make a list and make a big list. Look for people in other functions, if they're hosting events, if they're sponsoring events. Try to cast a really broad net. And then once you have that list put together, then you really want to put together a project team. I've seen a few organizations who always default to, great, we'll grab the VP of sales, the VP of marketing. That's one option. I think they need to be aware. From my experience, sometimes it's better to have supported keeners or people a little lower down in the organization who can pick up and do some of the work, but ensuring that that team becomes very cross-functional. It can't just be legal's or security or privacy's initiative, and it can't be marketing's initiative because it impacts so many different places. And then the last point kind of goes along with the image next to it, which I think it's really important when you're dealing with something around privacy, compliance, that sort of stuff, to create a bit more of an approachable tone. This was actually on the day that GDPR came into effect, and we've got our VP of Ops, our VP of Marketing, our demand gen manager, and myself sporting NYPD ripoff shirts, just to kind of create a little bit of a lightheartedness, but also give people an identity of who can you go to if you have questions about this. If somebody responds to an email you sent and they're like, where did you get my data? Well, now you know some of the people in the office who you can come to with those questions. So really try to demystify it and, sorry, Martin, de-legalify it, make it much more approachable. And then the third thing rather, you can focus on doing is really getting into strategically aligning those business units. Yes, it's regulation, yes, you have to do it, but it's much easier to find ways to make people want to do it than tell them they have to. And so some of the examples of that might be looking across your organization for metrics or goals they have. Every group has them. And so if you see your marketing organization has a metric like increasing your newsletter list by 30%, well, trying to now comply with GDPR or CCPA is going to be harder because the opt-in requirements are a little bit higher than what they might have right now. At the same time, if you were to just shift that over to growing newsletter engagement, which is more of a quality metric instead of a quantity metric, now your marketing team is actually going to get a lift by moving towards something where people are opting in. Those people have already raised or done a stronger hand raise, and so now they're probably more likely to engage. So you can kind of see that shift. Similar in the sales development approach, rather than talking about how many contacts should you prospect per day, you could look at conversion ratios or, again, engagement rates, really shifting from those quantity measures into quality measures to then kind of move towards that opt-in as a strategy as opposed to an inhibitor of your goals. And Martin will pick that up in a little bit as well to dig in more there.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to think about it. And I love the t-shirts and these examples of messages to share outside the organization, because it does sound like it's really important to have your group, your cross-functional team on this, have some support. Like it can't just be them against the rest of the organization and trying to make it happen. So I love the pull rather than push technique. One question that I had was, so you've got your cross-functional team. Is there where does ownership lie? Is there one owner ultimately for the performance of that team, and how did you decide who that was?
Yeah, I think you need to have, there's lots of different frameworks on it. There needs to be somebody who's responsible for delivering the project, and then somebody who is the end owner of that. And I think it can be helpful, depending on the size of your company, to isolate those two. So the owner of something like privacy needs to be somebody in an organization who can hold that risk and make those decisions for the company. In our case, our owner was our VP of operations. But the actual readiness effort and sustained compliance efforts needed to happen there. That's not something he can own as a project. So that's where it was more just who has capacity and that project management ability to kind of get this through. And so in our case, it was in the ops side ended up owning it. There's other companies that have done different examples. If they have more sort of marketing engagement in it, maybe the marketing person ends up owning that project. But it can kind of come from whoever has the capacity right now to deliver it.
Cool. And then so you also mentioned like casting a wide net, and I imagine that's because you may be surprised to find the different roles or departments in your organization that are gathering or somehow handling prospect data or customer data. So was there any like surprises as you were doing this? Like, did you stumble upon somebody, I don't know, in accounting that you were surprised to see had some system that needed to be covered?
In our case, we weren't really surprised by the stakeholders, but we were surprised by the authority that some of the stakeholders had in making decisions about that data. And so while we knew that our product team may collect some data and may do things, we didn't understand how much ownership they had felt over that, and that things like requiring opt-in before issuing surveys or new feature releases wasn't something they expected was going to happen from it. And so it wasn't so much in the identification, but we didn't really spend enough time early on bringing them into understanding what these changes mean. And so there were some learnings that way for sure.
Got it. And okay, and I know we have some tips later on about how to build a better understanding of like the picture of where all the data lives in your organization. So before we get on to that though, we actually have another poll here. So audience, if this is your first Sales Hacker webinar, you're quickly learning that participation is mandatory here. And thank you for all your questions, by the way. So has your team identified stakeholders? Have you started for anything in preparation for CCPA compliance? Just pick one of the options, please. I know my answer. All right, let's close that poll and see the results. You know what? Not too bad. So 31% of you have identified some stakeholders and started preparations. I'm proud of you. 40% of you are going to do that later this afternoon, and 29% of you are going to find out if you've already done that later this afternoon. Cool. So that's actually like a 30-30-30 split, more or less. Sean, does that surprise you actually, given where we are right now with CCPA kicking in right at the beginning of next year?
I don't think it surprises me particularly. That's roughly where I would have expected it to come in. I also think a lot of companies can lean on what previously happened with other regulations, and now there's a bit more understanding of how this works. So if you're starting now, I don't think you're too late by any stretch of the imagination. You just have to make sure, and Martin will get to a bit of this, that you're not starting from today. You need to actually accept any data that's coming from a little bit further back in the time period.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. So to do that, you have to know what's happening right now, where customer data is flowing. And as we all know, marketing stacks, sales stacks are just getting taller and taller and more complex. So where do we start, Martin? How do we do this?
Yeah, so data mapping and system inventory is not a new problem. It's just more pronounced by regulations like GDPR and CCPA. But the premise here is you can't action or protect what you don't know about. So this is really a precursor to meeting those data subject requests to delete data or export it, when people want to know what data you hold about them. The identifying your stakeholders is going to be key for this. I know when I started cataloging all of the software, I own IT here at Outreach as well. I was surprised to see the height of that marketing stack, to go, wow, okay, well, where's all this data going? It's key to understand what systems are integrated with one another, right? And so it's not just mapping the data, it's understanding its flow as well. This is also really important for CCPA's look back requirement. To describe what that is, we've said here that CCPA takes effect in January 2020, but starting in January 2020, a consumer can come to you and ask, hey, what did you have on me 12 months ago? They have the ability to ask you to look back 12 months, and if you don't know where that data has been over that period of time, you'll find yourself in some hot water. So start doing this now. It also allows you to comply with CCPA's breach notification rules. Again, if you don't know what to monitor, you're not going to be able to notify if something is breached. There are a lot of technologies out there around data loss prevention. Once you know where the data is, you can apply those technologies so that you know if data is being exfiltrated or lost in any way. The strategy we're taking here at Outreach is to implement a data governance policy and program. And what I mean by that is, of course, we have an information security program. We have a privacy policy on our website. This is part and parcel of those, but different. And really what this does is it spreads that responsibility for the data across the organization. So you heard Sean say that, hey, product was actually kind of surprised that some of these things came, that others were surprised about the authority that people had over data. Our data governance policy is defining that authority for them. We form a council around that. So we have the notion of data stewards, right? and our VP of finance is the data steward for our finance data. Ultimate decisions around how that data is accessed and handled is up to that individual, with input from a council of folks if there are integrated systems. So this is really a way to democratize the management of this data and bring those stakeholders into the fold and into a program that's ongoing.
No, interesting. So I like the idea of creating a policy around this. If I'm starting from scratch, let's say, I've got my stakeholder group that Sean recommends I put together, and the first thing I'm asking you to do is just take an inventory and map where data is transferred and stored.
Yeah.
How are people doing that? Like, is it a massive spreadsheet or an ugly flow chart? Like,
Yes.
how does that happen? Both.
A lot of people are using spreadsheets, but there are some tools out there that help you do this. We have started from the spreadsheet model, but Daniel, I don't know if you want to chime in on some of the tools that are available for this.
So Martin's referring, so we have a live data map that allows for companies to be able to integrate with their SSO providers and procurement providers and other systems to essentially programmatically understand what systems you're using, whether they're in marketing or in finance or in accounting or HR. There certainly are ways you can do it. There are other providers out there, but most folks are doing it with spreadsheets, and so this is pretty manual. Sean will talk about it a little bit more in detail around what would be required if you want to do this manually coming up here, and that is an option, but it is a bit of a challenge for most businesses.
Got it. Yeah, I can imagine. Okay, so the other thing that you mentioned earlier, Martin, was that like the big change here is that this is, well, I don't know. I guess one thing to think about is if you're already compliant with GDPR, how you want to think about your strategy of becoming compliant with CCPA, also having in mind that like probably more regulations are coming.
Absolutely.
So when you think about like a strategy and preparation for that, how do you think about it?
So I think about it, I think as I said earlier, as what's the most restrictive and how can we make that a benefit to the business and follow that across the customer, across our customer base. I think, complexity is the enemy of compliance, right? So if you're going to go, I'm going to do this for my EU customers and this for my US customers, and oh, by the way, I want to go to sell to Asia and they've got privacy laws coming up, and next thing you know, you've got one coming out of Massachusetts and Washington. Now you get a federal. You'll never be able to manage that effectively. You have to come up with a comprehensive program that covers as much of that as possible. And so we're taking the approach of opt-in versus opt-out. And what that means, you saw in earlier slides that CCPA says you must have an opt-out on your website if you intend to sell that personal data. Well, we'll allow people to opt out, but what we're going to do first is ask them to opt in for every single person that we whose data we collect, right? Whether they're in the EU, the US, California, or any other state. So the strategy here is get ahead of the game, right? Start collecting consent now to store and process, and as you know, in the case of CCPA, sell an individual's data.
One of the questions that we got, this was from Rob, thanks for the question, Rob, was that the question is, I guess, around the nature of opting out, and then also around the nature of like what counts as selling data. So if I upload email addresses to Facebook to run a retargeting campaign, is that the kind of thing that I need to allow people to opt out of?
Yeah, I think yes, I think it is the type of thing you need to allow people to opt out of, but I also think those definitions are still in flux, and we're taking a conservative approach, and making sure that people have opted into that, right? You don't want to find yourself as the Cambridge Analytica of CCPA, right?
Right. Right.
And so, again, that strategy is get that consent up front. You can do that in a number of ways. It can be in your privacy policy by downloading this. You agree to all the terms of the privacy policy, right? Click here to say you agree. There's a number of ways to gather this. I don't think we're fully baked on the definition of what it means to sell someone's data, but I do think it will extend much farther than just a transactional, you gave me money for a list of contact information. It's going to be broader than that.
Right, right. Daniel, what about you? Are you guys seeing on this topic or on the topic of like strategy adoption? Do you just move towards an all opt-in strategy or segmentation? What are you seeing from your customers?
Yeah, so I think customers and in conversations with the press, I mean, I think it's difficult for companies to do exactly as Martin described, right?
It's gonna be tough.
A different way to operationalize a piece of regulation. So if there are 15 regulations, you have 15 different ways of managing someone's data. This is not going to happen. And so, some businesses are trying that. I don't think that's the right path forward. I think Martin's description there of, take a one standard. And in this case, I think for opting in, I think we see probably a 50-50 split on that, but I do think that it's the right approach. In terms of the sale of data, yes, that part is much broader than what's typically being defined. So it's not just data providers in the typical sense. In circumstances where information is not anonymized but is provided to data exchanges, so things like ad providers, for example, that or credit providers or information that's shared for insurance. So when you apply for insurance, you may provide access for your information to be shared with 50 different insurance providers. Of course, they ask you if you consent to that, but you can ask them to delete your information and they must federate it to all of those providers. So some businesses here are generally operating their entire business on the sale of data or acquiring information from third parties. That's going to make things very difficult. And so I think this is an important piece to mention as folks look at CCPA, because it is very different in terms of that particular point.
Okay. So at some point here, people are going to start receiving the privacy requests, especially like you said, if they don't already get these requests due to GDPR, because they operate only in the States, say, they will probably start receiving some. What does that look like? How do you see people handling them? Like, is there a spectrum of good to bad? Tell us about it.
Yeah. So first off, I think, Sean's point, and Martin kind of highlighted as well, that really you need to have, some form of stakeholder alignment and a process in place to manage these. If you're the front line and you're in sales and you're on this webinar, kudos to you. If you're receiving messages January 1st, or perhaps you're prospecting into Europe today and you're finding people responding with, where did you get my information? Challenge your internal stakeholders to, have a policy in place that is similar to what Martin described, where it's very clear what happens when someone asks that type of question. And so, what that actually ultimately looks like, and what we advise, is that there's sort of two ways, right? One, you want to have that internal process. So, probably responding to the person and saying, well, I got your information from, a data source, or I guessed your email address. That's probably not appropriate, in that they actually are looking for a complete response, and a complete response in an access request may be the data that exists in many different places, in places that you have outside of your purview. So generally our advice is, have a system in place where you forward the email to privacy at your company's domain. or, alternatively, set up a form that someone can actually submit their request for access, deletion, sale of data. That is something that we provide for our customers because it makes, really dispositioning these types of things a little faster. Because you can imagine people may send all types of things to Privacy app, or they may ask questions that are hard to understand. When you've got a drop-down box, it makes it significantly easier.
So I imagine that there's a spectrum here, and like some people may receive one request a month, some people may receive 100 requests a day. It probably depends on a lot of things, but Martin, I imagine that for outreach, at least, this falls under your purview, correct me if I'm wrong, but how do you think about communicating this out to the customer-facing team, and how do they handle these requests when they come in?
Yeah, so this does fall to my team under, for accountability, but we share the action with our technical support engineers. So they're tier 1, tier 2 for the requests that come into privacy. And we get all kinds of requests. They're not just data subject requests for deletion or export. But we partner then with those service engineers for data export, for deletion. But one of the key things we're doing actually is building this in to the platform. So making this as self-service as possible for our customers, right? So we obviously use our own platform. That then starts to fall to the customer-facing team. Oh, you've got a request coming in. Great. Go into the platform, show that, export that data ourselves, show the customer how to use our platform to export that data, and track the request via our ticketing system.
And so one of the things I wonder, I guess, is if I'm a customer-facing rep, the first time I get a request, maybe it seems kind of formal. Hey, can you please erase my data, or please provide record of how you got my data. What do I say if it's the first time I've gotten that request?
Yeah, so we provide training for all our customer-facing reps as these things come up, and then the easiest thing, at least what we do here, is the easiest thing for them to know is we have this email address, privacy@outreach.io, and so they point people directly there and go, I'm unable to take the action, but here's our privacy policy, and here's how to get a hold of the team to take action.
Yeah,
okay. Exactly. That's what you're seeing too, Daniel?
Yeah.
When it's done manually.
Yeah, if you're if someone is asking for deletion of data, whether they're in the GDPR or in CCPA, that data needs to be deleted across all systems within the business. So not just your own product, but everything else. And so naturally, whether you're in a customer-facing team, you probably don't have access to every system your organization is using. So the fastest way to ensure it gets provisioned and completed effectively is just as Martin described, right? Have a process in place where you, either forward the email to Privacy app or a form to create a method of retrieving the data from all of those respective systems or deleting the data from those respective systems.
Got it. Okay. And then so, we're painting this picture. It's the new privacy age. We all at this point expect more of these to come, more regulations, that is. At some point, this maybe, I don't know, maybe they aren't as closely aligned as GDPR and CCPA. Maybe there's a new one that looks really different and has a different flavor. Like, we can all expect that this is going to become more complicated. So how do we think about how do we build into our organizations a way to handle that? Because it seems like a manual response, like we have this one form for CCPA, another form for GDPR, won't work.
So absolutely. I mean, the operationalizing this process is going to be important. Really that's sort of the final piece here, right? As we sort of think about stakeholder alignment, understanding the systems that are in place, understanding how people get into those systems, right? Responding to when people actually say, hey, I'm not actually comfortable with the data that you have about me, and I'd like to remove myself. Last part is sort of how do you actually operationalize that across the business? And so if you think about that, I think Sean touched on it. It's, really what would actually happen if there was a new piece of regulation going forward every month? And so if that were to happen, you would need to be prepared, so to speak, for this every month, right? And so if your systems that you're using in your business change on a weekly basis, marketing goes and invests in a tool, or human resources buys another tool, or the talent team or the recruiting team are buying different tools, which is pretty common at this point. Really, you've got to update the way you're actually looking at that on an ongoing basis, not just, getting ready for CCPA. This is going to be the reality. So thinking about it in terms of like almost on a monthly cadence, right? And so what does that actually look like? So if you break it down, right, there are different teams in a business that may have and hold personal data. So one's information. They could be from list purchases, right, from data providers. If you're in marketing, it could be from sourcing prospects. If you're in sales, adding them to sequences, right? It could be product or customer success, sending surveys or collecting information about people. So there's a bunch of different places within a business that may be interacting with an individual's data. And so, if you think about it, legal and security needs to be involved in those steps. And really, that's a process that you will want to repeat on an ongoing basis. Every time you're buying a new tool or adding new fields, perhaps to your outreach environment, or adding new fields to Salesforce that are collecting information, you want to engage with the legal or security team. And then I'd say, there's sort of two ways to do this, right? Clearly, if you are intending to do it manually, that would involve setting up a regular recurring meeting with the folks that set up these types of protocols around, new systems or new fields within those systems, and making sure that everyone's aware of what happens when those fields or systems are added. And then, obviously, that flows down to how do you respond to when someone actually asks for a deletion or a retrieval of data. And alternatively, there are tools on the market. DataGrail is one of them that provides sort of a continuous approach to this. So detecting when new systems are added, notifying when new fields exist within within an environment, so that this really becomes somewhat automated, and really the person just manages the system.
And if I can kind of just double click on one of the pieces there, just from a project management standpoint on it, oftentimes we end up focusing on, what systems are you using right now? Because that's what I need for my list. When you start having to repeat this so often, it's going to be really important to climb upstream of what you care about. And so that's where your stakeholders may start involving procurement as an easy example. If they're involved in signing off or approving a new purchase, you need to make sure that that also has a component so that that purchase gets registered in with your legal and security team. Now there's sort of a little bit more of a manual process, but you can at least maintain that active inventory. The same sort of thing when you're hiring new people, or if you're going to be training new IT or operations folks, they need to understand what sort of fields have personal data. So if somebody asks, hey, can you add a new field for this? They know that that needs to go back into legal and security. So then it's not about, I need to send another set of surveys out. All that is still pretty manual. And so as you can get more into the automatic tooling, depending on the size of your organization, sometimes that's a more efficient way to go about it. And you also need to make sure you have enough legal capacity to work with all these hey, how do I requests? So if you only have one or two system admins, maybe you can, work with a manual process. As there are more and more people involved in actually administering these systems, automatic starts looking a lot more appealing.
Right, and that makes sense. So I don't know what else we've got in the deck here, but we do have a couple other questions that we could get to. And folks, it looks like we have 5 minutes. So if you have a question you haven't yet asked, don't save it for your deathbed. Go ahead and throw it out there. So a couple of these are pretty quick and simple. Let's get through them. Are Californians protected outside the state of California? If I throw an event in New York and a Californian resident attends, do I have to afford them the same rights given that I collected some of their personal data while they were at my event in New York?
Yes.
Yes, yeah.
Yep.
Yep.
Easy one. This one's kind of interesting, and I think we mentioned this, somebody mentioned anonymization earlier, but if I have records and somebody asks for a deletion, does anonymizing the record meet the requirement if I've already collected it and it was personalized beforehand?
I think that's one of those ones that will eventually be decided in the courts, but I will say that Outreach is taking the stance that yes, if it's sufficiently anonymized, that counts as deletion.
Interesting. And if it's anonymous to begin with, there is no issue, right?
Yeah, but what we mean by anonymized here, so there's anonymized and pseudo-anonymization, and what we mean by that is really think about it as jumbling an email address, so it's unusable, it's not real. It's, you know, you might have a data set that contains a lot of non-personal data, and in the fields for personal data, it's a bunch of gobbledygook. That's how we think about anonymization. And in that regard, if your data model works such that you can't have a null field or a blank field, then we'll transform that into something that is not your contact information.
Got it. Some kind of mess. Daniel, are you seeing something different, or do you have a different view of that?
Yeah, so it's an interesting point with Martin, because if you think about it, right, if someone is asking for deletion of their data, what Martin described is really the only way to effectively do that, unless you have an alternative tool to track it, right? Because if you're trying to do it internally, you would have to anonymize data in order to maintain a record that you actually deleted the other data. Otherwise,
right.
You have a record of the individual. So it's a complicated thing around deletion. It's also worth mentioning that just because you went into a particular tool and deleted your data within their user interface, so they've made a user interface that you can go and click and delete. I would say 90% of technology providers today, that is not deleting the person's data out of that environment. Right. They are absolutely keeping a backup. And so just be aware, you know, that's something that most companies are doing. So yeah, just simply anonymizing is probably not enough in other companies' environments.
And if I can just toss sort of one piece of advice for any ops people on here, anonymization will often feel like oh great, that'll like help me meet every stakeholder's needs. Get legal involved in whatever you're going to do for anonymization, because it's not as simple as just, I screwed up their email address. If there's other personal data present, regulation will be touchy there. So get help if you're in ops and you think you can anonymize.
Yeah,
makes sense.
And I think Daniel's point about digging into the other systems is really important. We had to do this for GDPR. If you click delete in Outreach, we know the systems where that deletes, but we also know that that data may exist in other systems for analytics. And so we have to work very closely with our business analytics and our engineering team to make sure that that deletion process hits everything and all the way to the backup, right?
Which even further drives home the point that an ongoing process, a way to operationalize this, and maybe at the start, but maybe always, Sean, having a stakeholder group with eyes on this would be crucial. Somebody else asked what tool we mentioned, and maybe I garbled it. It's not data rail, it's data grail, as in the Holy Grail, data grail. We're up against time, and I want to make sure everybody goes off and gets to their next thing. So Martin, Sean, Daniel, thank you so much for stopping by and sharing some of your knowledge. If people want to get in touch with you after this, how can they do that?
So at least for myself, I am on Twitter at GaiJin Gaijin Dan. That's Japanese for foreign person, if you're curious. And you can email me at daniel@datagrail.io.
Yeah, Sean at datagrail.io, or reach out on LinkedIn. It's probably the cleanest way for me.
Yep, same here, LinkedIn or martin.ruiz@outreach.io.
All right, and you can see me every Tuesday and Thursday Sales Hacker webinars. If this is your first one, we do 2 of these a week, and the topics range wildly, so feel free to stop by another time. I hope to see you around. Thanks again for coming to this one, and I'll hear from you all soon. Take care.